My name is Mabel Wood. I was 26 the afternoon my father tried to breach the security perimeter of my commercial underwriting firm in Bozeman, Montana. The atrium strobe lights cast a pale blue rhythm across the imported marble floor. Down by the reception desk, a man in a salt-stained canvas work jacket was shouting my name. He left streaks of gray slush near the electronic turnstiles, holding a heavy ivory postcard in his fist like a weapon. I watched him from the descending glass executive elevator. I held a single manila folder against my tailored charcoal blazer. My pulse rested at a steady 60 beats per minute. He expected his public unraveling to force a concession. He assumed the threat of corporate embarrassment would make me yield the leverage I held over his entire life. He was operating on outdated data. And what I handed him when those elevator doors opened is the reason you are listening today. Welcome back to Aura Vengeance, where we sit with the quiet strategists who stopped arguing with toxic families and started building paper trails instead. If stories about ironclad boundaries, clinical detachment, and the slow execution of consequences are your kind of evening, you are in the right place. Drop your age in the comments and tell me where you are listening from. Subscribe so the next story finds you. To understand why my father drove 800 miles to scream my name in a corporate lobby, I have to take you back 8 years, back to the freezing draft of our Oregon farmhouse. I was 18. I stood near the threshold, holding a faded canvas duffel bag. It held my clothing and a high school diploma. I did not possess a professional network or a financial safety net. I was simply leaving an ecosystem built entirely on my father's ego. Richard Wood leaned against the doorframe, sipping dark coffee from a ceramic mug. He did not ask if I had a place to sleep. He did not offer a map or a tire gauge for the incoming November storm. The wind rattled the loose window panes, a structural defect he always claimed he would fix, but never did. He just chuckled. It was a dry, scraping sound that echoed down the narrow hallway. He set the mug on a side table and reached into his back pocket. He pulled out his worn leather wallet. He told my mother, Susan, that I lacked the spine for the real world. He snapped a crisp $50 bill from the leather fold. The green ink caught the overhead light. He held it up and said he bet 50 I would be back in 6 months begging. Susan smiled. It was the tight, practiced expression she reserved for moments when she needed to align with his cruelty to preserve her own comfort. She said she gave me a year. They finalized the wager right in front of me. I was not a daughter setting out into adulthood. I was a metric for their shared superiority. A fragile version of myself might have dropped the bag. I might have demanded validation or engaged in a shouting match to defend my worth. But emotion grants the other party leverage. I looked at the $50 bill. I recorded the serial number in my memory, treating the moment as a visual receipt detailing the exact cost of their faith in me. I turned the brass knob, stepped out into the freezing air, and pulled the heavy wooden door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place. It sounded exactly like a starting gun. The true cost of my departure did not end with a wager. It began an hour later at the Greyhound station. The terminal smelled of diesel exhaust and old floor wax. The fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow hue over the waiting area. I sat on a hard plastic bench, waiting for the outbound bus to Montana. I unzipped my duffel bag to retrieve my wallet for a cup of black coffee. I had exactly $400 to my name, saved from a summer of wiping down tables at a local diner. When I opened the leather fold, my stomach dropped. The bills felt too thin. $200 were missing. My older brother Harrison had been sitting on the living room sofa while I packed. He was the golden child, a boy whose failed startups and reckless spending were continually subsidized by my father's contracting business. He was alone in the room with my bag while I used the restroom before leaving. I stood in that terminal, gripping the empty wallet. I accepted the stark reality of my bloodline. I was not just a scapegoat. I was a resource to be mined. My brother stole half my survival fund, and my parents sent me into the winter with a bet on my ruin. I zipped the bag shut. I boarded the bus. I did not shed a tear. Tears blur your vision, and I needed to see the road ahead very clearly. Bozeman, Montana is a city that does not care about your backstory. It demands rent on the first of the month. Waking up in a strange city with exactly $200 is a lesson in stark mathematics. Every breath feels like it costs money. I bypassed the decent apartments and secured a tiny, drafty studio above a dry cleaner. The radiator hissed but produced very little heat. My mattress was thin enough to feel the metal springs against my spine. Finding work required swallowing every ounce of pride. I walked into a diner 3 blocks away and pointed at the Help Wanted sign. The manager handed me an apron smelling of stale grease and fried onions. I worked double shifts. I learned to carry 3 heavy porcelain plates on one arm. I learned to smile at exhausted truckers while my own arches ached and my feet throbbed. At the end of every night, I sat on my mattress and counted my tips. Every coin was a barrier between me and the bet my parents made. The diner money kept me breathing, but it provided an unexpected education. Late one Tuesday evening, I served black coffee to a local farmer. His hands were calloused and his shoulders slumped beneath a faded canvas jacket. He stared into his mug and talked about losing his generational land. He did not lose it to a bad harvest. He lost it to a corporate holding company. He explained the mechanics of triple net leases and mezzanine debt. He detailed how shadow lenders structure high-interest loans designed specifically for predatory liquidation. He looked up at me and said, "They do not come with guns anymore. They come with clipboards." I wiped down the laminate counter and listened to the terminology of ruin. I realized that brute force did not destroy empires. Paperwork did. Signatures, default clauses, and compound interest were the silent weapons of the real world. I absorbed his grief and converted it into data. I filed the terminology away in my mind, unaware that I was studying the exact blueprint I would one day use to dismantle my father. The seasons turned. The bitter winter melted into a wet spring, followed by a dry summer. The anniversary of my departure arrived. Day 365. I walked into a corner pharmacy and bought a blank postcard. I used a photo printing kiosk to print a picture I took of the chipped paint on my cheap apartment door. There was no glamour. There was no sunshine. It was just the hard truth of my daily existence. I clicked a cheap pen and wrote a brief message on the back. Rent paid, not begging. I wrote out their address in Oregon, attached a vintage stamp, and dropped the card into a blue postal box on the corner. The sound of the paper hitting the bottom of the metal bin felt like a victory. I survived the parameters of their wager. I sent the postcard as an undeniable receipt of my existence. I did not realize then that this annual ritual would provoke a retaliation so severe it would force me to freeze my own identity just to survive the incoming collateral damage. The diner apron eventually smelled like a closed chapter. By my 20th birthday, I traded the grease-stained uniform for a discounted wool skirt and a data entry position at a commercial underwriting firm in downtown Bozeman. The environment provided a profound shift from the chaotic clatter of porcelain plates. The office hummed with the low frequency of server towers and the crisp rustle of printed contracts. We dealt in the architecture of risk. We calculated the exact probability of failure for commercial fleets, retail centers, and local contractors. I spent my days staring at dual monitors, absorbing the cold terminology of asset protection, liability shields, and guarantor obligations. The farmer I served at the diner had given me the vocabulary. The underwriting firm gave me the application. I lived a quiet, disciplined existence. I sent the year 2 and year 3 postcards on schedule. They featured photographs of my modest cubicle and a new winter coat. The messages remained brief. I did not ask for updates from Oregon. I focused entirely on building an impenetrable financial foundation. By age 21, I possessed a modest savings account and what I assumed was a pristine, untouched credit history. That assumption fractured on a Tuesday morning in late October. The transmission in my second-hand sedan had started grinding whenever I shifted into third gear. The heater core was dead, blowing frigid air against the windshield during the early Montana frosts. Survival required reliable transportation. I scheduled an appointment at a local credit union during my lunch hour to secure a small auto loan. I carried my recent pay stubs in a neat manila folder, confident in my solvency. The loan officer was a quiet woman wearing wire-rimmed glasses. She typed my Social Security number into her terminal. I watched her fingers move across the keyboard. The routine process should have taken 90 seconds. Instead, she stopped typing. She leaned closer to her screen, her brow furrowing. She clicked her mouse twice, printed a document, and slid the paper across her desk. She did not offer a congratulatory handshake. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional concern. She informed me that my application was denied. The rejection was not due to a lack of credit history. It was due to severe delinquency. She tapped a manicured fingernail against a specific line item on the printed report. The paper detailed a 6-figure commercial equipment lease originating in Oregon. The account was severely past due, bleeding late fees and triggering automatic default protocols. The debt was tied directly to my name, my date of birth, and my Social Security number. I walked out of the credit union and sat inside the freezing cabin of my failing sedan. The vinyl steering wheel felt like ice beneath my palms. I did not cry. I engaged the analytical portion of my brain. Someone in my bloodline had weaponized my identity. My immediate conclusion landed on Harrison. My golden child brother possessed a long, documented history of financial incompetence. He routinely launched amateur startups, burning through capital and relying on our parents to cover his deficits. He still lived near the farmhouse. He had easy access to the filing cabinet in the hallway where my childhood tax documents were stored. The profile fit perfectly. Harrison stole half my cash at the bus station. It made logical sense that he would eventually steal my identity to fund his next reckless venture. A younger sibling might have called him. A betrayed sister might have dialed his number demanding explanations and threatening police involvement. But yelling at a thief only alerts them to hide the stolen goods. I returned to my underwriting cubicle. I bypassed my daily assigned files. I possess the digital tools to investigate compromised assets, and I turned those tools toward my own compromised name. I contacted the fraud department of the shadow lender holding the equipment lease. I utilized my professional title to bypass the lower-tier customer service representatives. I requested the original digital signature logs and the time-stamped Internet Protocol address associated with the loan origination. The representative, assuming he was dealing with a fellow financial institution, emailed the encrypted data file to my secure terminal. I opened the spreadsheet. I copied the numerical address and ran it through a standard geolocation tracker. I expected the digital pin to drop on Harrison's upscale rental apartment. I braced myself for the sting of sibling betrayal. The map loaded. The red digital marker did not hover over Harrison's zip code. It landed squarely on a commercial industrial park on the outskirts of my hometown. It was the exact registered address of Richard Wood Contracting. The revelation shifted the air in my cubicle. The man who stood in a doorway and bet $50 that I would fail within 6 months was secretly utilizing my clean credit to float his sinking empire. Richard projected the image of an untouchable local titan. He mocked my lack of a safety net while covertly tying his own financial survival to my unblemished name. The hypocrisy was a tangible, heavy thing. He did not view me as a daughter. He viewed me as a pristine, unconsenting guarantor. Rage is a potent chemical, but it clouds judgment. I let the anger wash over me for exactly 60 seconds, and then I locked it away. I approached the betrayal as a risk management scenario. The liability belonged to him, and I needed to amputate the connection before the infection spread to my clean accounts. I did not send an angry text message. I did not demand an apology. I opened 3 separate browser windows navigating to the official portals of the major credit bureaus. I initiated a hard security freeze across my entire profile. This legal action mandated that no new lines of credit could be opened, modified, or extended without my direct, multi-step authorization. I then drafted a formal identity theft affidavit. I attached my Bozeman residential lease, my utility bills, and my Montana state identification, proving I was 800 miles away when the Oregon loan was executed. I submitted the notarized packet directly to the Shadow Lenders Fraud Division. By executing these clinical steps, I severed the fraudulent umbilical cord. I reclaimed ownership of my name. What Richard failed to realize when he forged my signature was the specific mechanical nature of shadow lending. High-risk commercial leases are not static. They require an automated annual credit review to process the scheduled renewal of the terms. I knew his review date was approaching. I knew the lender's automated system would attempt to ping my credit report to verify the guarantor's solvency. I set the trap and waited. I knew the system would slam into the impenetrable security freeze I had erected. The technical failure would trigger an immediate chain reaction within the lending division. I left my office that evening feeling a profound sense of equilibrium. I had transformed an act of parental betrayal into a tactical advantage. But to ensure the affidavit was ironclad, I needed supporting documentation of his past behavior. That night, sitting in my drafty apartment, I logged into an old, forgotten family cloud storage account. I searched for early financial records I might have left behind. Instead of finding tax returns, I found an archived backup of Richard's text messages from the week I moved out. I clicked on a thread between him and Harrison, dated the exact morning I waited at the Greyhound station. The words on the glowing screen unraveled the last remaining thread of my childhood illusions. The stolen $200 was not an act of sibling greed. It was an orchestrated hit, and discovering the true architect of that theft would force me to stop playing defense and start dismantling his life brick by brick. The glowing screen of the laptop illuminated the dark corners of my Bozeman apartment, casting harsh shadows across my hands resting on the keyboard. The archive folder from the family cloud storage contained a digital graveyard of old photographs, expired warranties, and mundane text exchanges. I clicked on a thread between my father and my brother, dated the exact morning I left the farmhouse 8 years prior. I stared at the timestamps. The messages were exchanged while I was using the restroom, just minutes before I picked up my duffel bag. Richard sent the first text. The words were stark and transactional. He instructed Harrison to unzip my canvas bag and remove half the cash inside. The next sentence detailed the objective. He wrote that stripping my survival fund would guarantee I missed my first rent payment in whatever city I landed in. He wanted to ensure I crawled back to the farmhouse before the 6-month wager expired. As a reward for executing the theft, Richard told Harrison to keep the stolen $200 to fund a weekend road trip. I sat very still. The low hiss of the radiator faded into the background. The realization reorganized the fundamental architecture of my past. The $50 bill Richard flashed in the doorway was not a spontaneous wager born of mere arrogance. It was a theatrical prop. The entire departure was a rigged game. I was not simply abandoned to the elements. I was actively hunted by the people appointed to protect me. They engineered my starvation to validate their own superiority. A daughter might have wept at the profound depth of that betrayal. A portfolio manager merely updates the risk assessment. I closed the laptop. The final lingering thread of familial obligation dissolved, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. I had already initiated the hard security freeze on my credit profile and filed the identity theft affidavit regarding the forged equipment lease. Now, I simply had to wait for the mechanical efficiency of consequence to execute its programming. Shadow lenders operate on unforgiving algorithms. They do not care about local reputations or country club memberships. They care about liquidity and risk mitigation. 30 days after I locked down my identity, Richard's commercial equipment lease entered its automated annual review cycle. The lender's system dispatched a digital query to the credit bureaus to verify the guarantor's standing. The query slammed into my security freeze. The digital brick wall rejected the inquiry, instantly generating a critical error code within the lender's underwriting department. In the high-risk commercial sector, a blocked guarantor check is treated as a fatal breach of contract. The system did not generate a polite warning letter or offer a grace period. It triggered an automatic default sequence. The entire outstanding balance of the heavy machinery accelerated, rendering the debt immediately payable in full. Richard did not possess the operational cash to clear the ledger. The resulting scene in Oregon was a masterpiece of public exposure. On a busy Tuesday morning, a fleet of heavy recovery wreckers idled onto the gravel lot of Richard Wood Contracting. The diesel engines rumbled, sending thick plumes of exhaust into the crisp air. The recovery agents did not knock on the office door to negotiate. They secured heavy iron chains to the axles of the excavators and skid steers. I did not have to be there to envision the sequence. I knew the layout of his lot. I knew the local competitors drove past that stretch of highway every single day. Richard stepped out of his office, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. He shouted at the drivers, wielding his usual intimidation tactics, threatening lawsuits and demanding respect. The recovery agents simply handed him the default paperwork outlining the failed guarantor check. Richard looked at the printed document. He realized in that exact moment that the phantom cosigner he exploited had severed the cord. He possessed zero legal standing to halt the repossession because the machinery was leased under a name that no longer answered to him. The yellow iron disappeared down the highway, taking his operational capacity with it. The seasons continued to turn. I channeled every ounce of my energy into my university coursework and my data entry position. The physical toll of sleep deprivation was balanced by the growing digits in my legitimate savings account. Year 5 arrived. I walked across a local campus stage and accepted a Bachelor of Science in Finance. I paid for every credit hour out of my own pocket. I owned 0 student loans. I purchased my annual blank postcard. I framed a tight, high-resolution photograph of the diploma. I wanted the raised gold foil of the university seal to be undeniable. I flipped the card over and wrote the update. Day 1825. Degree acquired. 0 debt. I affixed the vintage stamp and dropped it into the postal system. The loss of the heavy machinery had crippled Richard's revenue streams. He could no longer bid on lucrative municipal projects. He was cornered, scrambling for liquidity to keep his remaining trucks fueled and his golden child subsidized. The arrival of the Year 5 postcard provided a fresh target for his humiliation and rage. Instead of downsizing his lifestyle, he decided to extract his revenge through the federal government. Tax season provided his weapon. Richard instructed his corporate accountant to claim me as a financial dependent on his filings. He fabricated a comprehensive narrative, signing federal documents stating he provided more than half of my living expenses and tuition costs. It was a desperate, illegal maneuver designed to secure a substantial tax deduction and artificially inflate his return. The federal machinery grinds slowly, but it grinds exceedingly fine. The automated systems at the Internal Revenue Service flagged the severe discrepancy. Another taxpayer had already filed an independent return under my Social Security number. The system generated a formal notice of audit. I returned to my Bozeman apartment after a grueling 10-hour shift. I opened my mailbox and extracted a thick brown envelope bearing the official seal of the Department of the Treasury. I tore the flap open and scanned the stiff bureaucratic paper. The document outlined the conflicting dependency claim. To protect the integrity of the federal treasury, the IRS placed an immediate temporary hold on my modest savings account, pending the resolution of the investigation. The timing was surgical. The underwriting firm had just offered me a promotion to a junior risk analyst position. The new role required a professional wardrobe and a deposit on an apartment closer to the corporate district. The capital I meticulously saved over 5 years was suddenly locked behind a federal firewall. My debit card was useless. My safety net was frozen. As I stood in my kitchen staring at the audit notice, my cell phone vibrated against the laminate counter. The screen illuminated with an incoming message from Susan. My mother rarely reached out unless it served a specific narrative purpose. I opened the text. It was a high-definition photograph of Harrison. He stood at the base of Mount Hood, wearing expensive fiberglass goggles and tailored snow gear. He held a pair of premium ski poles, grinning at the camera. The caption beneath the photo read, "Family always sticks together. He deserves a break from the stress." The contrast was profound. My mother was entirely oblivious to the financial mechanics funding her existence. She did not know her husband had committed tax fraud. She only knew they received a sudden influx of cash, and they immediately funneled it into a luxury weekend for the son who refused to work. They were subsidizing ski passes with my stolen financial independence. A typical citizen facing a federal audit freezes in terror. The threat of government penalties paralyzes them. I looked at the photograph of Harrison. Then I looked at the IRS notification. I did not dial their number to hurl accusations. I did not waste my breath demanding fairness from people who only understood leverage. I walked down the narrow hallway of my apartment and opened the bottom drawer of my metal filing cabinet. I bypassed the panic entirely. I withdrew 5 distinct manila folders. The tabs were labeled by year. Inside those folders rested half a decade of unassailable documentation. Every rent receipt, every utility bill, every tuition payment, and every pay stub from the diner and the underwriting firm. The IRS requested proof of my independence to resolve the discrepancy. They asked for a minor clarification. I prepared to hand them a meticulously indexed, notarized dossier, proving a multi-year pattern of financial abuse. My father sought to punish me by invoking the authority of the federal government. He failed to realize that by inviting the auditors into our lives, he had just handed me the exact weapon required to dismantle his empire. The text thread I pulled from the archived cloud server did not remain a painful digital memory. I transformed it into Exhibit A. Sitting at the laminate counter of my Bozeman apartment, I assembled the response to the federal audit. The Internal Revenue Service requested standard proof of my financial independence to resolve the conflicting dependency claim my father filed. I decided to provide them with a comprehensive forensic accounting of his corruption. I printed the time-stamped messages where Richard instructed Harrison to steal my $200 at the bus station. I placed that document right behind the notarized identity theft affidavit from the forged commercial equipment lease. I stacked 5 years of independent tax returns, utility bills, and pay stubs on top. I was not simply defending my own tax filing. I was constructing a federal pivot. By handing the auditor documented proof of his prior identity fraud and premeditated financial sabotage, I guaranteed the investigation would shift from my modest savings account directly onto his corporate ledger. I placed the thick stack of paper into a priority envelope, secured the flap, and mailed it via certified post. Then I waited. The federal bureaucracy operates with glacial indifference. For 40 days, my bank accounts remained frozen. I navigated my promotion to junior risk analyst while wearing my old discounted skirts, calculating my grocery budget down to the final cent. I did not complain. Endurance is just another form of currency. On a damp Thursday afternoon, the official Treasury seal appeared in my mailbox again. The letter inside contained a final ruling. The auditor reviewed my extensive documentation and validated my independence. The freeze on my routing numbers lifted instantly. My capital was restored. The corresponding action taken in Oregon was severe. The IRS did not merely reject Richard's fraudulent dependency claim. The evidence I provided triggered a forensic review of his entire contracting business. The federal government levied crippling penalties for the fraudulent filing, demanding immediate payment of back taxes coupled with exorbitant fines. The repossession of his heavy machinery had bruised his ego. The federal tax levy gutted his remaining operational cash. He was trapped in a financial corner of his own making, suffocating under the weight of federal compliance. With my funds unlocked and my new analyst salary depositing bi-weekly, I executed my first major acquisition. I did not rent a nicer apartment. I entered the real estate market. I located a distressed, century-old duplex in a revitalizing Bozeman neighborhood. The property required extensive renovation. The roof shingles curled at the edges, and the original hardwood floors were buried beneath decades of cheap linoleum. A standard buyer would see a liability. I saw unencumbered equity. I navigated the closing process with clinical precision. I read every clause of the mortgage agreement. I signed my name on the bottom line, ensuring no phantom guarantors or hidden cosigners existed in the margins. The title transferred solely to Mabel Wood. Every swing of the sledgehammer I used to tear down the damaged drywall felt like dismantling the invisible barriers my family had erected around my future. I sanded the century-old wooden beams by hand, breathing in the sawdust and the distinct scent of ownership. The 6th anniversary of my departure arrived during the renovation process. I stood in the center of the gutted living room. The afternoon sun illuminated the dust floating in the air. I held the heavy brass keys to the front door in my palm, pressing them against the newly exposed brick wall. I captured a photograph. The image was raw and industrial, a stark contrast to the sterile farmhouse I left behind. I printed the image on heavy cardstock. I flipped the rectangle over and uncapped my pen. I wrote a 2-word update. Title, Holder. I attached the vintage stamp and dropped the card into the postal system. I knew the message would strike a specific, unprotected nerve. Real estate was the foundation of Richard's self-worth. He judged a person entirely by the property they controlled. 3 days later, my cell phone vibrated across my makeshift plywood dining table. The caller identification displayed an Oregon area code. It was Richard. Direct contact was a rare occurrence. He usually delegated his communication through Susan or utilized silent sabotage. A direct call meant he was highly agitated. I pressed the green icon and held the device to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. Richard did not say hello. He launched into a rapid, strained monologue. His voice lacked the booming resonance that used to rattle the windows of our house. He sounded thin. He sounded like a man drowning in bad debt. He demanded to know why I was flaunting a dilapidated slum while my brother struggled to find his footing. The IRS fines had decimated his reserves. He could no longer afford to subsidize Harrison's lifestyle. My older brother had recently been evicted from his luxury rental due to consecutive missed payments. Richard, blinded by his own entitlement, attempted to reassert his patriarchal dominance by attacking my investment. He ridiculed my decision to buy a broken-down shell, claiming true executives hired contractors for everything. He boasted about his own commercial acreage, conveniently omitting the fact that his land was currently leveraged to the breaking point. Then he pivoted to his true objective. He informed me that Harrison needed an upscale apartment to clear his mind and focus on his next business venture. He issued a sharp directive. He commanded me to use my underwriter's salary and my stellar credit score to co-sign a 12-month luxury lease for Harrison in downtown Portland. He framed it as my familial duty, insisting I owed my brother a head start since I had hoarded all the financial success for myself. I stood amid the sawdust and exposed wiring of my living room. 8 years ago, that exact tone would have frozen the blood in my veins. It was the voice that dictated the strict rules of my existence. Hearing it now, filtered through a cellular connection across 800 miles, the sound felt hollow. The power dynamic had shifted so profoundly that he could not even perceive the change. He was attempting to bully a corporate risk analyst using the tactics of a schoolyard tyrant. I waited for him to pause for a breath. The silence stretched for a singular second. I stated the word no. I did not elaborate. I did not offer an excuse about my mortgage or my renovation budget. Explanations imply the other party holds the authority to reject your reasoning. I pulled the phone away from my face and ended the call mid-sentence. The quiet that followed was exquisite. I placed the device back onto the plywood table and picked up a sanding block. The phantom grip Richard held over my nervous system evaporated into the Montana air. I spent the remainder of the evening smoothing the baseboards, unbothered by the empty threats of a man who held zero leverage over my life. But a wounded predator is far more dangerous than a comfortable one. The swift rejection stripped away the last remnants of his pride. By cutting off the conversation, I denied him the emotional reaction he craved. He realized that the daughter he bet against was now a credentialed professional, capable of inflicting serious financial damage. He needed to reassert control, and he needed to do it publicly. Unable to reach me by phone, Richard turned to a different avenue of attack. He accessed the federal audit paperwork the IRS had mailed him. The documents contained the official employment verification forms from my underwriting firm. He read the corporate letterhead. He noted the name of the senior director overseeing my division. He located my professional sanctuary, and he began drafting a plan to burn it to the ground. The underwriting firm occupied the 14th floor of a steel and glass structure overlooking the Gallatin Valley. The environment demanded flawless precision. We wore neutral colors. We spoke in measured tones. The apex of this hierarchy belonged to the senior director, a woman who navigated the commercial property crashes of the early 2000s and possessed zero tolerance for inefficiency. She occupied a transparent cube suspended in the center of the office, a soundproof panopticon, where she could observe the entire trading floor. It happened on a rain-swept Wednesday morning. The digital clock on my terminal displayed 10:14. My desk phone remained silent, but the executive assistant bypassed the senior cubicles and stopped directly at my station. She did not offer a pleasantry. She instructed me to gather my belongings and report to the main conference room. The ambient chatter of the surrounding analysts ceased. A mid-morning summons to the glass cube usually preceded an unceremonious exit from the building. I picked up my leather briefcase. My heels clicked a steady, unhurried rhythm against the hardwood corridor. The conference room felt like a vacuum. The thick glass walls filtered the outside noise into a dull, rhythmic thrum. The senior director sat at the head of a long mahogany table, her hands folded over a legal pad. Her expression was entirely unreadable. She gestured for me to take the seat opposite her. I sat down, placing my briefcase on the floor beside my chair. I kept my spine straight. She informed me she had just endured a 40-minute phone call regarding my employment. The caller identified himself as Richard Wood. He bypassed the front desk screening protocols by fabricating a severe family medical emergency, claiming his wife was being rushed into surgery and he needed to reach his daughter immediately. Once the receptionist bypassed standard procedure and connected him to the executive suite, the theater commenced. The director recounted the conversation with surgical accuracy. My father had put on a masterful performance. He utilized the trembling pitch of a heartbroken patriarch desperate to save his child. He painted a vivid picture of a fractured mind. He told my boss I was fundamentally unwell, suffering from severe paranoid delusions. The narrative he spun was intricate. He claimed I fled my hometown of Oregon because I embezzled thousands of dollars from his local contracting business. He insisted I was a pathological liar, prone to erratic behavior, framing my employment at the firm as a profound security risk. He begged the director to terminate my contract immediately. He argued losing my job was the only way I would hit rock bottom. He claimed stripping me of my corporate livelihood would force me to seek the psychiatric intervention I supposedly required back under his roof. It was a tactical strike aimed directly at my only lifeline. He wanted to shatter my professional reputation and starve me out. He assumed the sheer embarrassment of a familial dispute infiltrating the workplace would force me into panicked submission. A typical junior employee would crumble under the weight of such an accusation. Most people would cry. They would stammer through desperate pleas to defend their character, letting panic dictate their response. I felt my pulse maintain its steady 60 beats per minute. I knew his playbook intimately. He operated on the flawed assumption that public shame was my primary vulnerability. He forgot I spent the last 5 years reading commercial leases and federal tax codes. I leaned down and unlatched the brass clasps of my briefcase. The metallic snap echoed sharply in the quiet room. I retrieved a thick manila folder and slid it across the polished mahogany surface. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer an emotional defense of my character. I simply instructed the director to open the file and review the contents. The first document she encountered was the official clearance letter from the Internal Revenue Service. I explained the mechanics of the recent tax fraud. I detailed how Richard attempted to claim me as a financial dependent to secure an illegal deduction for his failing enterprise. I pointed to the federal seals, proving the government had penalized his business while clearing my name entirely. I noted it was this very federal paperwork that provided him with the firm's letterhead and her direct contact information. The director turned the page. The next document was the notarized identity theft affidavit from the shadow lender. I walked her through the timeline of the forged commercial equipment lease. I explained how my pristine Social Security number was weaponized to secure heavy machinery for a drowning business. I laid out his exact operational deficits. I broke down his current debt-to-income ratios and his impending insolvency. I dissected my own father with the detached precision of a corporate liquidator dismantling a shell company. I did not speak about my feelings. I spoke only in verifiable data points and federal rulings. I watched the director read the paperwork. Her eyes tracked the signatures and the formal banking letterheads. She searched my posture and my tone for a crack in my composure. She found zero evidence of the unstable, erratic girl Richard described over the phone. I sat with my hands resting flat on the table, projecting the calm authority of a woman who had already won the war. The silence stretched for several long minutes. The distant, muted movements of the analysts continued outside the glass walls. The director finally closed the manila folder. She aligned its edges parallel to her legal pad. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair and steepled her fingers. She noted my dry eyes and steady breathing. She recognized I had just neutralized a catastrophic personal attack without a single ounce of sentimentality or fear. A predator recognizes another predator. She saw a young woman who could compartmentalize betrayal and transform it into a documented defense strategy. She stated the commercial real estate market did not reward emotional fragility. She told me the firm required individuals who could look at a bleeding asset and feel nothing but pure leverage. She admired the efficiency of my preparation. The director stood up from the table. She instructed me to return to my cubicle and pack my belongings into a cardboard box. I was no longer a junior risk analyst. She was moving me out of the general underwriting bullpen. She reassigned me to the most ruthless division within the entire brokerage. I was now a core member of the Distressed Asset Division. My new operational mandate was to identify failing businesses, acquire their toxic loans for pennies on the dollar, and liquidate their properties. The attempt to destroy my career had merely accelerated my ascent. My transition into the acquisitions division changed the lens through which I viewed the world. My daily routine involved touring bankrupt retail centers and abandoned industrial parks. I learned to calculate the exact moment an enterprise became unsalvageable. I spent my hours dissecting financial ruin, stripping away the emotional attachments owners held for their failing businesses, and looking solely at the underlying numbers. While I honed my skills in Montana, the protective shell surrounding my Oregon finally shattered. Harrison had spent his entire adulthood shielded from consequence, insulated by Richard's fading wealth. That insulation created a profound, dangerous entitlement. Believing he possessed the same contracting acumen as our father, Harrison secured a lucrative independent residential construction project. He did not possess the necessary municipal permits. He did not purchase the mandatory liability insurance. He simply assumed the rules did not apply to him. The project was a catastrophic failure. A structural collapse during the framing phase resulted in severe property damage to the neighboring estates and critical injuries to a subcontractor. The resulting civil lawsuit was swift and merciless. The injured parties filed a gross negligence claim against Harrison, seeking punitive damages far exceeding any standard insurance payout. To keep his golden child out of a concrete cell and satisfy the impending legal settlements, Richard exhausted his final meager credit lines. The traditional banks refused to lend him another dime. Cornered by his own hubris and desperate to maintain the illusion of the perfect family, Richard crossed a line from which there was no return. He sought out a shadow regional lender, securing a toxic, high-interest mezzanine loan. The terms were brutal, featuring predatory interest rates and a strict acceleration clause. To secure the capital, Richard utilized his only remaining unencumbered asset. He pledged the Oregon family farm as collateral. The trap was set, and the mathematics of their ruin began to tick. The federal clearance from the Internal Revenue Service served as a watershed moment. The official Treasury ruling did not merely unlatch the shackles my father tied to place on my routing numbers. It provided the vital liquidity required to execute my first major acquisition. I did not upgrade to a luxury high-rise in the corporate district. I entered the real estate market with calculated intent. I located a distressed, century-old duplex in a revitalizing Bozeman neighborhood. The property possessed excellent structural bones, but required severe discipline to restore. The roof shingles curled at the edges, and the original hardwood floors remained buried beneath decades of cheap, cracked linoleum. A standard residential buyer would view the structure as a crippling liability. I viewed it as unencumbered equity. I transformed the gutted living room into a physical manifestation of my independence. I spent my weekends wearing a respirator mask, tearing down damaged drywall, and sanding the original wooden beams by hand. I breathed in the sharp scent of sawdust and old pine. The exposed brick walls served as my sanctuary. I held the heavy brass keys in my palm, feeling the cold, solid weight of ownership. I captured a photograph of those keys resting against the brick. I printed the image on heavy cardstock and wrote a 2-word update on the reverse side. Title, Holder. I attached the vintage postage and mailed the Year 6 postcard to Oregon. It was a tangible receipt of my stability, standing in stark contrast to the financial crater my family was currently excavating. While I fortified my foundation in Montana, the protective insulation surrounding my older brother dissolved. Harrison faced a crippling civil lawsuit following his uninsured construction collapse. The impending legal settlements threatened to put him in a concrete cell. To shield his golden child from the consequences of his own staggering entitlement, Richard pledged the generational family farm to a shadow lender. He mortgaged his history to subsidize incompetence. He believed he had outsmarted the system, assuming the predatory mezzanine loan was just another line of credit he could intimidate and juggle. He did not understand the ruthless, automated architecture of distressed debt. He did not realize shadow lenders routinely package and sell their high-risk portfolios to larger corporate liquidators when regional markets begin to fluctuate. That specific market fluctuation occurred in late autumn. A major regional bank in the Pacific Northwest buckled under the weight of toxic commercial loans. The shadow lender Richard utilized, desperate for immediate liquidity to cover its own deficits, bundled its most precarious assets and offered them at a closed corporate auction. The underwriting firm in Bozeman, my employer, specialized in acquiring and dissecting these exact portfolios. I transitioned my role from junior analyst to active predator. I transformed the quartz kitchen island of my duplex into a tactical command center. I logged into my secure corporate terminal, the dual monitors casting a harsh white glow across the sanded floorboards. I did not evaluate the hundreds of failing strip malls and bankrupt logistics companies randomly. I utilized our proprietary municipal software to filter the data streams. I searched for specific zoning codes, tax histories, and commercial ledgers originating in rural Oregon. I typed the geographical coordinates of my childhood home into the search parameters. The digital ledger populated on my screen. The data detailed a high-interest mezzanine loan secured by agricultural acreage. The primary guarantor listed was Richard Wood Contracting. The ink on the digital contract was barely dry, yet the mathematics of his ruin were already encoded into the fine print. The interest rate was punitive. The acceleration protocols were strict and unforgiving. The lender held the unilateral right to seize the collateral upon a single missed payment. I compiled the asset profile into a sleek, undeniable presentation. I walked into the soundproof glass cube of my senior director. I did not frame the acquisition as a personal vendetta. personal vendettas cloud judgment and create corporate liabilities. I presented the Oregon farm as a prime liquidation opportunity. I highlighted the underlying land value against the distressed nature of the debt, proving the acquisition would yield a substantial profit margin for the firm. The director reviewed my projections. She noted my flat, clinical delivery. She authorized the purchase without hesitation. To ensure my identity remained entirely concealed from the county records in Oregon, I structured the acquisition through a blind corporate entity. I filed the legal paperwork through a registered agent in Delaware, naming the limited liability company Keystone Heritage Holdings. The title sounded sufficiently bureaucratic and mundane. It deflected casual scrutiny while providing an impenetrable corporate veil. The firm wired the capital. The transaction cleared the Federal Reserve. The power dynamic inverted permanently. I officially became the legal debt holder of my father's empire. Richard remained entirely ignorant of the shifting tectonic plates beneath his boots. He believed he was dealing with a faceless shadow lender located hundreds of miles away. The sudden influx of cash from the mezzanine loan granted him a false sense of security, temporarily inflating his bruised ego. He required a target for his renewed arrogance, and the Year 6 postcard sitting on his desk provided the perfect catalyst. My cell phone vibrated across the hardwood floor of my living room. The screen displayed his Oregon area code. Direct contact was an anomaly. I pressed the green icon and held the device to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. Richard launched into a rapid, strained monologue. His voice lacked the booming resonance that used to rattle the windows of our house. It sounded thin, carrying the distinct pitch of a man drowning in bad debt. He mocked the duplex, calling it a dilapidated slum. He ridiculed my decision to purchase a broken-down shell, boasting about his vast commercial acreage. He remained blind to the exquisite irony that his land was now legally bound to a holding company I controlled. He quickly pivoted to his primary objective. The civil lawsuit had stripped Harrison of his luxury rental. The golden child was effectively homeless, sleeping on the sofa of the farmhouse, complaining about the draft. Richard commanded me to utilize my corporate salary and my pristine credit score to co-sign a 12-month luxury lease for Harrison in downtown Portland. He framed the directive as a fundamental familial duty. He insisted I owed my brother a head start, since I had selfishly hoarded all the financial success for myself. I stood amid the exposed wiring and fresh sawdust of my living room. 8 years prior, his voice would have triggered a severe physiological panic response. It was the voice that dictated the strict, unyielding rules of my existence. Hearing it now, filtered through the cellular connection, the sound felt weak. He was attempting to bully his own landlord to secure housing for the very sibling who stole my survival funds at the bus station. I waited for him to pause for a breath. The silence stretched for a singular, heavy second. I stated the word no. I did not elaborate. I did not justify my decision or offer a financial excuse about my renovation budget. Explanations grant the opposition a foothold for negotiation, and I yield leverage to no one. I pulled the phone away from my face and ended the call mid-sentence. I placed the device back on the table and picked up a sanding block. The phantom grip he held over my nervous system evaporated into the crisp Montana air. He possessed zero power to compel me. I knew his operational cash was depleted from the legal fees, and I knew the first of the month was rapidly approaching. The ledger was waiting, and the default clock was about to start ticking. The abrupt termination of the phone call stripped away the last remnants of Richard's authority. By delivering a single syllable and severing the connection, I denied him the emotional reaction he craved. He could not bully me into submission. He could not shame me into compliance. He realized that the daughter he mocked in the doorway 8 years ago was now a credentialed professional operating entirely outside his jurisdiction. The loss of control, coupled with the crushing financial weight of the IRS penalties and the new mezzanine loan, ignited a volatile desperation. He needed to reassert dominance, and he required a public arena to execute his retribution. Unable to break my boundaries directly, Richard launched a covert, calculated strike against my professional sanctuary. The Internal Revenue Service, in their bureaucratic efficiency, had mailed him a comprehensive breakdown of the audit resolution. Included in that thick federal packet were the official employment verification documents I submitted to prove my financial independence. He examined the paperwork. He read the corporate letterhead. He noted the physical address of the Bozeman high-rise and the specific name of the senior director overseeing the underwriting division. He located the very structure that provided my stability, and he prepared to burn it to the ground. The underwriting firm operated on a strict hierarchy of access. The reception desk filtered all incoming communications, shielding the executives from unsolicited solicitations and hostile clients. Richard understood he could not simply demand an audience with the senior director. He utilized a tactic designed to bypass corporate protocols by exploiting basic human decency. It happened on a Tuesday morning. The trading floor hummed with the usual urgency. Analysts scrutinized spreadsheets while the senior partners debated risk ratios in low, measured voices. I was auditing a newly acquired portfolio of distressed retail debt. My desk phone remained silent. 400 miles away, Richard dialed the main switchboard. When the receptionist answered, he did not project his usual booming arrogance. He adopted the frantic, breathless tone of a terrified patriarch. He claimed his wife was suffering a massive cardiac event. He stated the paramedics were currently loading her into an ambulance, and he needed to reach his daughter immediately before she entered the surgical theater. He layered the lie with specific, fabricated medical terminology, playing on the receptionist's empathy. The panicked urgency overrode the standard screening process. The receptionist transferred the call directly to the executive suite, routing the transmission to the senior director. The moment the director answered, Richard abandoned the medical emergency narrative and commenced his true objective. He performed a masterful theatrical monologue. He wept over the line, utilizing the trembling pitch of a heartbroken father desperate to save his child from her own destructive tendencies. He painted a vivid, intricate picture of a fractured mind. He told my boss I was fundamentally unwell, suffering from severe paranoid delusions and a history of chronic instability. The narrative he spun was meticulous. He claimed I fled Oregon at 18 not to build a life, but because I had embezzled thousands of dollars from his local contracting business. He insisted the federal audit was merely a symptom of my deeper financial crimes. He framed my employment at the underwriting firm as a profound security risk, suggesting I possess the capacity to compromise sensitive corporate data. He begged the director to terminate my contract immediately. He argued that losing my job was the only ethical course of action. He claimed stripping me of my corporate livelihood would force me to hit rock bottom, compelling me to seek the psychiatric intervention I supposedly required back under his roof. It was a tactical strike aimed directly at my only lifeline. He wanted to shatter my professional reputation and starve me out. He assumed the sheer embarrassment of a familial dispute infiltrating the workplace would force me into panicked submission. The director listened to the entire performance. She did not interrupt. When Richard finished his desperate plea, she calmly disconnected the line. She stepped out of her transparent, soundproof cube suspended in the center of the office. She instructed her executive assistant to summon me. The atmosphere on the floor shifted instantly. The assistant bypassed the senior cubicles and stopped directly at my station. She did not offer a pleasantry. She instructed me to gather my belongings and report to the main conference room. Colleagues lowered their eyes to their monitors. A mid-morning summons to the glass cube usually preceded an unceremonious exit from the building. I picked up my leather briefcase. My heels clicked a steady, unhurried rhythm against the hardwood corridor. I did not experience a physiological spike in anxiety. My pulse maintained its steady 60 beats per minute. I knew his playbook intimately. He operated on the flawed assumption that public shame was my primary vulnerability. He thought the threat of corporate embarrassment would make me surrender. He forgot I spent the last several years mastering the language of documented liability. The conference room felt like a vacuum. The thick glass walls filtered the outside noise into a dull thrum. The senior director sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her hands folded over a legal pad. Her expression was entirely unreadable. She gestured for me to take the seat opposite her. I sat down, placing my briefcase on the floor beside my chair. I kept my spine straight. She recounted the phone call with surgical accuracy. She detailed the accusations of embezzlement, the claims of mental instability, and the demand for my immediate termination. She watched my face closely, waiting for the inevitable emotional collapse. A typical junior employee would crumble under the weight of such an accusation. Most people would cry. They would stammer through desperate pleas to defend their character, letting panic dictate their response. I leaned down and unlatched the brass clasps of my briefcase. The metallic snap echoed sharply in the quiet room. I retrieved a thick manila folder and slid it across the polished mahogany surface. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer an emotional defense of my character. I simply instructed the director to open the file and review the contents. The first document she encountered was the official clearance letter from the Internal Revenue Service. I explained the mechanics of the recent tax fraud. I detailed how Richard attempted to claim me as a financial dependent to secure an illegal deduction for his failing enterprise. I pointed to the federal seals proving the government had penalized his business while clearing my name entirely. I noted it was this very federal paperwork that provided him with the firm's letterhead and her direct contact information. The director turned the page. The next document was the notarized identity theft affidavit from the shadow lender regarding the forged commercial equipment lease. I walked her through the timeline. I explained how my pristine Social Security number was weaponized to secure heavy machinery for a drowning business. I laid out his exact operational deficits. I broke down his current debt-to-income ratios and his impending insolvency. I dissected my own father with the detached precision of a corporate liquidator dismantling a shell company. I did not speak about my feelings. I spoke only in verifiable data points and federal rulings. I watched the director read the paperwork. Her eyes tracked the signatures and the formal banking letterheads. She searched my posture and my tone for a crack in my composure. She found zero evidence of the unstable, erratic girl Richard described over the phone. I sat with my hands resting flat on the table, projecting the calm authority of a woman who had already secured the perimeter. The silence in the soundproof room stretched for several long minutes. The distant movements of the analysts continued outside the glass walls. The director finally closed the manila folder. She aligned its edges parallel to her legal pad. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair. She recognized that I had just neutralized a catastrophic personal attack without a single ounce of sentimentality. Her evaluation of my value to the firm was about to shift dramatically, propelling me directly toward the Oregon mezzanine loan. The director aligned the edges of the manila folder perfectly parallel to the edge of her legal pad. She steepled her fingers, her gaze moving from the federal seals on the documentation to my face. The ambient hum of the underwriting floor remained muted beyond the thick glass walls. She was a woman who had built her career evaluating risk, calculating the exact probability of failure in multi-million-dollar portfolios. She was accustomed to dealing with desperate individuals, hostile takeovers, and emotional volatility. She was not accustomed to an employee dismantling a parental smear campaign with the detached efficiency of a forensic accountant. She scrutinized my posture. My shoulders remained relaxed. My breathing was steady. There were no tears threatening to spill, no panicked stammering, no desperate pleas for understanding. I presented the facts of my father's financial corruption and identity fraud as objective data points, devoid of personal trauma. I treated his attempt to destroy my livelihood as a mere administrative hurdle that required immediate, documented neutralization. A predator recognizes another predator. She saw a young woman who could compartmentalize profound betrayal and transform it into a fortified defense strategy. She stated that the commercial real estate market did not reward emotional fragility. She told me the firm required individuals who could look at a bleeding asset and feel nothing but pure leverage. The empathy required to navigate standard human relationships was a distinct liability in the sector of distressed acquisitions. She admired the ruthless preparation of my dossier. The director stood up from the mahogany table. She did not hand me a termination notice. She instructed me to return to my cubicle and pack my personal belongings into a cardboard box. I was no longer a junior risk analyst in the general underwriting bullpen. She was transferring me. She reassigned me to the most elite cutthroat division within the entire brokerage. I was now a core member of the distressed asset division. My new operational mandate was to identify failing businesses, acquire their toxic loans for pennies on the dollar, and liquidate their properties to maximize corporate profit. The attempt to starve me out and shatter my reputation had merely accelerated my ascent. Richard's theatrical phone call provided the exact catalyst I needed to secure a position of true authority. I packed my desk with methodical precision, ignoring the curious glances of the junior analysts. I carried my box across the trading floor to the restricted wing. My new office possessed floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Gallatin Valley. I set my briefcase down and logged into the proprietary secure terminal. The transition into the acquisitions division fundamentally altered the lens through which I viewed the world. My daily routine shifted from entering data to touring bankrupt retail centers and abandoned industrial parks. I learned to calculate the exact moment an enterprise became unsalvageable. I spent my hours dissecting financial ruin, stripping away the emotional attachments owners held for their failing businesses, and looking solely at the underlying numbers. I evaluated foreclosure timelines, default penalties, and liquidation values. I became an architect of consequences. While I honed my skills in Montana, the protective insulation surrounding my older brother in Oregon finally shattered. Harrison had spent his entire adulthood shielded from reality, insulated by Richard's fading wealth. That insulation created a profound, dangerous entitlement. Believing he possessed the same contracting acumen as our father, Harrison secured a lucrative independent residential construction project in a neighboring county. He did not possess the necessary municipal permits. He did not purchase the mandatory liability insurance required by state law. He simply assumed the rules did not apply to him, operating with the reckless arrogance of a golden child who had never faced a penalty. He cut corners on the structural supports to inflate his profit margin, using substandard materials while charging premium rates. The project was a catastrophic failure. A structural collapse during the framing phase resulted in severe property damage to the adjacent estates and critical injuries to a subcontractor working on site. The resulting civil lawsuit was swift and merciless. The injured parties filed a gross negligence claim against Harrison, seeking punitive damages far exceeding any standard insurance payout. Because he operated without liability coverage, the financial burden fell entirely on his personal assets, of which he possessed none. The impending legal settlements threatened to put him in a concrete cell for criminal negligence. To keep his favored son out of prison and satisfy the initial court-mandated payouts, Richard exhausted his final, meager credit lines. The traditional banking institutions, noting his recent federal tax penalties and the repossession of his heavy equipment, refused to lend him another dime. His credit score was decimated. He possessed no liquid capital. Cornered by his own hubris and desperate to maintain the illusion of the perfect family, Richard crossed a line from which there was no return. He sought out a shadow regional lender securing a toxic high-interest mezzanine loan. The terms of the loan were brutal. Mezzanine debt is notoriously predatory, functioning as a bridge loan of last resort for drowning businesses. It featured exorbitant interest rates, compounding penalties, and a strict acceleration clause. To secure the capital, Richard utilized his only remaining unencumbered asset. He pledged the generational Oregon family farm as collateral. Susan, entirely oblivious to the predatory mathematics embedded in the fine print, posted a lengthy status update on a local community forum. She framed the massive debt as an act of noble sacrifice. She wrote about how family always sticks together through hard times, praising her husband's dedication to their son. She included a photograph of the farmhouse, completely unaware that the interest rates were mathematically designed for liquidation. She believed the loan was a temporary hurdle they could easily manage. She did not understand that shadow lenders actively anticipate default, intending to seize the underlying collateral the moment a payment is missed. Richard mortgaged his history to subsidize his son's incompetence. He believed he had outsmarted the system, assuming he could intimidate the new lender and juggle the payments just as he had always manipulated local vendors. He did not understand the ruthless, automated architecture of distressed debt. He did not realize that shadow lenders routinely package and sell their high-risk portfolios to larger corporate liquidators when regional markets begin to fluctuate. That specific market fluctuation occurred in late autumn. A major regional bank in the Pacific Northwest buckled under the weight of toxic commercial loans, sending a shockwave through the local financial sector. The shadow lender Richard utilized, desperate for immediate liquidity to cover its own looming deficits, bundled its most precarious assets. They offered the distressed debt portfolio at a closed corporate auction, seeking a buyer willing to take on the toxic paper for a steep discount. The underwriting firm in Bozeman, my employer, specialized in acquiring and dissecting these exact portfolios. Sitting in my new office overlooking the mountains, I received the digital notification of the upcoming auction. I realized the opportunity presented before me. I transitioned my role from passive observer to active predator. I turned my dual monitors toward the Oregon portfolio, preparing to hunt the very debt that held the deed to my childhood home. The 14th floor of the underwriting firm offered a panoramic view of the Gallatin Valley, but my focus remained locked on the glowing screens of my secure terminal. The distressed asset division operated on a different frequency than the rest of the building. We did not evaluate hope. We evaluated the precise mathematics of failure. My new position granted me access to proprietary municipal databases, federal court registries, and commercial lien tracking software. Out of professional habit and perhaps a lingering tactical caution, I maintained a passive digital algorithm tracking the public filings of Richard Wood Contracting. For months, the algorithm yielded nothing but routine permit renewals and standard vendor disputes. Then, on a crisp Tuesday morning in early October, the system chimed. A red notification badge illuminated the corner of my secondary monitor. A civil lawsuit had been filed in my hometown county court. The defendants listed were Richard Wood Contracting and my older brother, Harrison. I did not experience a surge of familial panic. I picked up my ceramic mug, took a slow sip of dark roast coffee, and clicked the digital docket to download the public filings. I read the plaintiff's initial complaint and the attached structural inspection report with the clinical detachment of a forensic auditor. Harrison had spent his entire adulthood insulated from reality. Richard shielded him from every consequence, cultivating a profound, dangerous entitlement. Harrison grew up believing that confidence equated to competence. He never apprenticed. He never earned a specialized license. He merely assumed the title of builder because he shared the patriarch's last name. Operating under the umbrella of our father's fading company, Harrison secured a lucrative residential construction project in a neighboring affluent zip code. The court documents detailed a catastrophic sequence of negligence. Harrison attempted to construct a heavy, multi-tiered load-bearing deck on a steep hillside property. To inflate his profit margin, he bypassed standard municipal oversight. He utilized substandard structural brackets and ignored basic soil retention protocols. He did not purchase the mandatory independent liability insurance required for high-risk elevation projects. He simply assumed the rules did not apply to his bloodline. The inevitable structural shear occurred during a severe autumn rainstorm. The saturated soil gave way, and the substandard brackets snapped under the sheer weight of the saturated timber. The entire framing structure collapsed, sliding down the embankment. It decimated a neighboring retaining wall, destroyed a luxury vehicle parked below, and critically injured a subcontractor working on the foundation. The resulting legal retribution was swift and unyielding. The injured subcontractor and the neighboring property owners filed a joint gross negligence lawsuit. In standard corporate law, an owner is shielded by the corporate veil of an LLC. However, because Harrison operated without proper licensure, bypassed city inspectors, and committed willful negligence, the plaintiff's attorneys easily pierced that corporate veil. The legal liability bypassed the empty shell of the business and attached directly to the personal assets of the owners. The financial burden threatened to place Harrison in a concrete cell for criminal endangerment. The court mandated immediate staggering restitution payments and froze the remaining operational accounts of the contracting business pending trial. I scrolled through the financial disclosures submitted to the court. Richard was officially cornered. He had exhausted his final meager credit lines trying to keep his trucks fueled after the federal tax penalties. His credit score was decimated. Traditional banking institutions reviewed his recent IRS fines, noted the repossession of his heavy machinery, and universally rejected his applications for emergency capital. He possessed zero liquid cash to satisfy the impending legal settlements. Desperate to maintain the illusion of the perfect, untouchable family, Richard crossed a line from which there is no return. He sought out the shadow market. Through the public Uniform Commercial Code filings, I tracked his digital footprint to a notoriously predatory regional lender based in Portland. This specific firm did not operate like a traditional bank. They were a loan-to-own syndicate. They preyed on drowning businesses, offering immediate liquidity in exchange for exorbitant collateral, fully anticipating the borrower would default so they could seize the underlying assets. Richard secured a high-interest mezzanine loan. I pulled the publicly recorded deed of trust and audited the terms. The mathematics embedded in the fine print were brutal. A standard mortgage requires a lengthy, regulated foreclosure process. A mezzanine loan is structured differently. It functions as a bridge loan, where the lender holds the right to execute a rapid, non-judicial foreclosure upon a single missed payment. The interest rate hovered near 19%, compounding monthly. The contract featured a strict acceleration clause and steep administrative penalties. To secure this toxic capital and keep his golden child out of a prison uniform, Richard utilized his only remaining unencumbered asset. He pledged the generational Oregon family farm as collateral. He signed the promissory note, effectively putting a ticking timer on the ground he walked on. He mortgaged his history to subsidize his son's entitlement. He believed he possessed the negotiation skills to intimidate the shadow lender and juggle the payments, failing to understand that algorithms do not respond to intimidation. While I dissected the brutal reality of their insolvency on my screens, I picked up my personal cell phone. Out of sheer sociological curiosity, I opened a social media application and navigated to my mother's public profile. Susan functioned as the public relations arm of the family, meticulously curating their image for the local community. Her latest post featured a vibrant, filtered photograph of the farmhouse. The front porch was decorated with seasonal wreaths. The caption beneath the image was a masterclass in delusion. She wrote a lengthy paragraph about how true families always stick together through adversity. She praised her husband's unwavering dedication to their son, framing the massive influx of debt as a noble patriarchal sacrifice. She received dozens of supportive comments from local acquaintances, praising her strength and family unity. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, comparing the sentimental drivel to the sterile legal documents on my monitor. The contrast was profound. Susan was entirely oblivious to the predatory nature of the contract her husband had just signed. She believed they had simply taken out a standard equity line to clear a temporary hurdle. She did not comprehend that the interest rates were mathematically designed to bleed them dry. She did not know that shadow lenders actively anticipate default, intending to seize the collateral the moment a payment cycle fails. She was decorating the porch of a house they essentially no longer owned. I set the phone face down on my desk. I felt no sorrow for their impending ruin. They cultivated a golden cage for Harrison, insulating him from every consequence. And now the cost of that insulation was demanding payment in full. By shielding him from failure, they had effectively amputated his ability to survive. And in doing so, they had bankrupted themselves. I returned my attention to the shadow lender's corporate profile. I recognized the firm's specific holding structure. I knew their operational history. When regional real estate markets began to fluctuate, this specific Portland syndicate routinely bundled their most precarious mezzanine loans and sold them at closed corporate auctions to mitigate their own risk exposure. They preferred to offload toxic paper for immediate cash rather than manage lengthy out-of-state liquidations. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and steepled my fingers. The pieces were moving into place on the board. The shadow lender held the deed to my childhood home, but their own liquidity ratios were notoriously unstable. I knew it was only a matter of time before they attempted to purge their high-risk portfolios. When that moment arrived, the underwriting firm in Bozeman would be perfectly positioned to receive the auction notice. I began drafting the preliminary risk assessment models, preparing to hunt the very debt that held my father's empire hostage. The broader economic landscape operates on a delicate, interconnected framework. When a foundational pillar cracks, the resulting seismic waves are felt far beyond the immediate epicenter. In late November, a prominent regional bank headquartered in Seattle buckled under a toxic portfolio of commercial real estate loans. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation stepped in, shuttering branches and seizing assets before the morning markets opened. The collapse sent an immediate, chilling ripple through the Pacific Northwest financial sector. Traditional banking institutions instantly tightened their lending criteria, hoarding their cash reserves. This defensive posture created a severe liquidity crisis for the shadow banking network. Syndicates and private lenders rely heavily on revolving credit lines from larger institutions to fund their high-interest bridge loans. When the credit lines froze, the shadow lenders faced devastating margin calls. The Portland-based syndicate holding the deed to my childhood home found itself starving for immediate operational capital. They possessed a vault full of high-yield, precarious mezzanine debt, but paper promises do not satisfy margin calls. To survive the quarter, the syndicate needed to convert their risky portfolios into liquid cash. They bundled their most volatile commercial and agricultural loans into a single distressed tranche. They offered the entire package at a steep discount through a closed corporate auction, prioritizing speed over maximum valuation. Sitting at my terminal on the 14th floor in Bozeman, I monitored the restricted auction portals. My proprietary municipal tracking software flagged the newly listed tranche the moment the Portland syndicate uploaded the digital prospectus. The glowing text on my secondary monitor detailed the contents of the bundle. It contained 42 distinct commercial loans spread across rural Oregon and Washington. I downloaded the encrypted data room files. My fingers moved across the keyboard, filtering the spreadsheets by county zoning codes and guarantor names. I bypassed the failing retail centers and the bankrupt logistics warehouses. I narrowed the search parameters until a single line item illuminated the screen. There it was, a high-interest mezzanine loan secured by 70 acres of prime Oregon agricultural land. The primary guarantor was Richard Wood Contracting. I opened the attached PDF containing the original promissory note. The digital scan displayed the harsh, unforgiving terms of the contract. The interest rate was punitive. The default clauses were written with predatory precision, allowing for rapid, non-judicial foreclosure upon a single missed payment. I scrolled to the final page of the document. Staring back at me from the glowing monitor was the distinct, sharp signature of my father. He signed away his legacy to shield a son who stole from his own sister. He bound his future to a contract he did not fully comprehend. I traced the digital ink with my cursor. The weapon required to dismantle his empire was no longer a hypothetical concept. It was sitting in a data room, priced for immediate liquidation. I did not let the profound irony of the moment cloud my strategic execution. Emotion is a liability in asset acquisition. I minimized the personal connection and evaluated the Oregon farm purely as a distressed commodity. The underlying acreage held significant value, far exceeding the current principal of the mezzanine debt. If the borrower defaulted, the acquiring entity could seize the collateral, liquidate the land, and turn a highly lucrative profit. The mathematics were flawless. I compiled the asset profile into a sleek, streamlined presentation portfolio. I stood up from my desk, smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, and walked across the trading floor. I approached the soundproof glass cube of my senior director. I knocked twice on the glass door and stepped inside. I did not frame the acquisition as a familial vendetta. I presented Tranche 4 as a prime corporate target. I slid the prospectus across the mahogany table. I highlighted the precise yield spread detailing the underlying land value of the agricultural assets versus the steep discount the Portland syndicate was offering. She reviewed my projections, her pen tracing the columns of data. She asked about the specific recovery rates if the primary agricultural borrower defaulted. I answered with cold, verifiable data points. I stated that the loan-to-value ratio guaranteed a minimum 70% profit margin upon foreclosure and subsequent land auction. I maintained a flat, clinical delivery, stripping every ounce of personal history from my vocal cadence. The director scrutinized the numbers for another minute. She nodded once, authorizing the capital allocation from the firm's acquisition fund. Securing the funding was only the first step. I needed to ensure the transaction remained invisible to the targets in Oregon. If Richard discovered his estranged daughter controlled his debt, he would pivot to his standard tactics. He would attempt emotional manipulation, weaponize my mother's perceived fragility, or file frivolous legal injunctions claiming a conflict of interest. To execute a flawless liquidation, the predator must remain unseen until the trap snaps shut. I returned to my office and initiated the formation of a blind corporate entity. I utilized a specialized registered agent based in Delaware, a state renowned for its impenetrable corporate privacy laws. Delaware does not require limited liability companies to disclose the names of their managing members on public registries. I drafted the Articles of Incorporation, naming the entity Keystone Heritage Holdings. The title sounded bureaucratic, sterile, and entirely unthreatening. It was the perfect camouflage. No county clerk in Oregon, and certainly no desperate local contractor, would ever connect Keystone Heritage Holdings to a data entry clerk who left town on a Greyhound bus 8 years prior. The corporate veil was cast in iron. With the legal architecture in place, I entered the closed digital auction on behalf of Keystone Heritage Holdings. The bidding process was swift. The Portland syndicate was desperate for cash and accepted our preemptive institutional offer just hours before the deadline. The capital wired out of Bozeman, clearing the Federal Reserve protocols seamlessly. The digital transfer of the physical assets completed by the end of the business day. The Portland syndicate reassigned the promissory notes, the deeds of trust, and the guarantor agreements to our holding company. The notification chimed on my terminal, confirming the successful acquisition of Tranche 4. I opened the newly established digital ledger for the Oregon farm. The file now belonged to my specific portfolio. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Montana landscape. The power dynamic inverted with profound, irreversible finality. The man who handed his wife a $50 bill and laughed at my departure was now legally bound to my corporate ledger. I possessed the right to dictate the terms of his survival. I owned the ground he walked on. But a contract is merely a promise until a breach occurs. I knew the civil lawsuit against Harrison was currently draining every remaining dollar from Richard's operational accounts. The legal fees the court mandated restitution, and the cost of keeping his golden child out of a prison cell left zero margin for error in his monthly budget. The high interest payment on the mezzanine loan was due on the first of the upcoming month. The trap was set, the camouflage was perfect, and the mathematics of their impending insolvency were inescapable. I rested my hands on my desk, watching the calendar digits on my screen, waiting for the inevitable moment the red ink began to bleed across my monitors. The defense of a gross negligence civil lawsuit operates as a relentless, unyielding vacuum for liquid capital. When Harrison collapsed that hillside framing project, he did not merely invite municipal fines. He triggered a cascade of billable hours, expert witness retainers, and mandatory settlement escrow accounts. Defense attorneys do not accept promises or local prestige as payment. They require certified wire transfers. Richard found himself trapped in a rigid financial corner. He prioritized shielding his favored son from a criminal record over maintaining the solvency of his own commercial obligations. The operational accounts of his contracting business dwindled to precarious levels. He diverted funds intended for vendor invoices, equipment, fuel, and essential insurance premiums directly into the legal trust defending Harrison. This desperate reallocation of resources left a fatal deficit in his monthly budget. The high-yield mezzanine loan he secured against the family farm demanded a staggering monthly payment. The contract offered no leniency and provided a mere 5-day grace period before punitive measures engaged. I sat at my ergonomic desk on the 14th floor in Bozeman, watching the digital calendar on my secure terminal roll over to the first of the month. I opened the specific portfolio assigned to Keystone Heritage Holdings. I brought the Oregon Agricultural Ledger onto my primary monitor. The screen displayed the scheduled automated clearinghouse transfer. The first day of the month passed. The Oregon bank account returned a pending status. The second and third days evaporated. I maintained my standard operational duties, analyzing other distressed assets for the firm, but my peripheral vision always caught the pending status on the Oregon file. At midnight on the fifth day, the grace period expired. The digital indicator on my screen shifted from a neutral gray pending status to a stark, undeniable red warning label: insufficient funds. The automated transfer had bounced. A standard regional bank might dispatch a polite courtesy email to remind a client of an oversight. A shadow lending portfolio, operating under the management of a distressed asset division, does not issue polite reminders. I moved my cursor over the default column. I opened the drop-down menu for administrative actions. The promissory note my father signed allowed for a distinct percentage penalty upon a failed transfer. I typed the precise penalty fee into the system. I clicked the execution key. The red ink on the spreadsheet expanded. The penalty capitalized, adding directly to the principal balance. The high interest rate immediately began compounding on top of the newly inflated principal. The mathematics of his ruin initiated their relentless upward climb. 30 days later, the cycle repeated. The ongoing legal battle surrounding Harrison continued to drain the Oregon accounts. The first of the next month arrived, and once again, the automated clearinghouse transfer returned an insufficient funds code. Richard missed his second consecutive payment. I applied the secondary default penalties. I updated the compounding interest parameters. The ledger now displayed a terrifying deficit. He was in severe breach of the commercial contract. The foundation of his rural empire was fracturing under the weight of his own signature, and the legal right to seize the property was quietly solidifying in my Bozeman database. The psychological toll of insolvency often produces a distinct, erratic arrogance in men who have never faced accountability. Richard required a mechanism to soothe his bruised ego. He needed to project superiority to counteract the profound loss of control he was experiencing in his daily operations. The sting of the Year 6 postcard showcasing my successful real estate acquisition still lingered in his mind. On a Thursday afternoon, my personal cell phone vibrated against the polished mahogany of my desk. The caller identification displayed the familiar Oregon area code. I picked up the device and pressed the green icon holding it to my ear. I remained silent. Richard spoke. His voice carried a manufactured, booming resonance. He adopted the tone of a seasoned corporate titan, imparting unsolicited wisdom to a naive subordinate. He did not call to inquire about my well-being. He called to construct a fictional narrative where he remained the untouchable victor. He informed me that the local shadow lender he previously utilized had sold his debt portfolio. He boasted about the transfer as if it were a strategic victory he orchestrated himself. He claimed the original syndicate lacked the capital to handle a client of his magnitude, forcing them to sell his paper to a large, out-of-state holding company. He spoke the name of my blind entity with dripping condescension. He said Keystone Heritage Holdings was just another bloated bureaucratic conglomerate. He bragged about his financial acumen, claiming real businessmen knew how to float capital and leverage debt to their advantage. He stated that skipping a few loan payments was a standard corporate strategy to free up immediate liquidity. He laughed his familiar scraping laugh. He told me the bureaucrats at Keystone Heritage Holdings were so disorganized they had not even sent a field agent to inspect his property. He assumed their silence equated to weakness. He believed the lack of immediate physical retaliation meant the new holding company was lenient, slow, and easily manipulated. He bragged that he would pay them whenever he saw fit, and they would simply have to wait. I sat in my office overlooking the Gallatin Valley. The Montana sky was a clear, piercing blue. My left hand held a ceramic mug filled with dark roast coffee. My eyes rested directly on the glowing red ledger of Keystone Heritage Holdings. The dramatic irony settled over the office like a heavy, exquisite velvet cloak. Richard was seeking validation from his estranged daughter by bragging about his ability to outsmart a corporate predator. He was proudly explaining his strategy of ignoring financial obligations to the exact underwriter who held the legal authority to evict him. He sought to diminish my achievements by inflating a phantom victory against a holding company I built specifically to dismantle him. He pivoted his monologue toward my duplex. He compared his sprawling 70 acres of prime agricultural land to my century-old urban property. He mocked the square footage. He ridiculed the fact that I spent my weekends sanding floors and painting walls. He stated that executives who performed their own manual labor lacked true vision. He told me I would always think small, confined to my little brick house, while he managed vast rural estates and navigated complex commercial financing. I took a slow sip of the dark roast coffee. The bitter, rich flavor grounded me in the present moment. I did not interrupt his performance. I did not correct his assumptions. Exposing the trap before it snaps shut is an amateur mistake. Letting the target dig his own grave provides a far more secure foundation for the impending burial. I listened to him inflate his ego with hot air. I let him paint a picture of his own untouchable brilliance. Every word he spoke reinforced the undeniable fact that he viewed me solely as an audience for his superiority complex. When his monologue finally wound down, he waited for my response. He expected a defensive remark. He wanted me to argue the merits of my real estate investment or express jealousy over his grand financial maneuvers. I lowered the coffee mug to the desk. I looked at the red numbers compounding on my secondary monitor. I ended the call. I did not say goodbye. I simply severed the connection, leaving him stranded in Oregon with a dead dial tone. I returned my hand to my computer mouse. The second missed payment had established the legal precedent. The contractual threshold was approaching rapidly. Month 3 would trigger the specific clause hidden deep within the promissory note. The mathematics of his incompetence were running their course, and the mechanism for his eviction was officially armed. The 90-day mark on a delinquent commercial loan is not merely a calendar milestone. It is a legal threshold. In the sector of distressed asset management, crossing this specific boundary shifts a file from a collection nuisance into a high-priority foreclosure target. Shadow lenders embed acceleration clauses into their contracts, specifically for this moment. When a borrower fails to satisfy their obligations for 3 consecutive billing cycles, the entire structure of the agreement collapses in favor of the creditor. Month 3 passed with predictable silence from the Oregon accounts. The legal trust defending Harrison against his gross negligence lawsuit had drained the final drops of liquidity from Richard's failing enterprise. The patriarch was floating capital he did not possess, attempting to run a business on the fumes of an expired reputation. He truly believed his strategy of ignoring the holding company was a viable path to survival. Month 4 arrived. The digital ledger on my secure terminal displayed 4 consecutive failed automated clearinghouse transfers. The red ink was no longer compounding. It was hemorrhaging. The debt reached the critical acceleration threshold. The promissory note Richard signed under the pressure of keeping his golden child out of a concrete cell was fully armed. I sat in my 14th floor office, the Montana sky shifting into a bruised pale gray outside the glass walls. I authorized the shift in asset status. I moved the Oregon agricultural file from the active management queue directly into the liquidation pipeline. The corporate machinery engaged instantly. The legal department of Keystone Heritage Holdings, operating through our specialized foreclosure counsel, generated the formal documentation. This was not a standard collection letter. It was a localized notice of intent to foreclose. The document manifested on my screen as a crisp, undeniable PDF. The firm utilized a sterile, imposing corporate letterhead. The language contained within the paragraphs was devoid of any human empathy. It did not recognize local prestige or historical family ownership. It spoke exclusively in statutes, civil codes, and strict financial ultimatums. The notice detailed the total sum of the 4 missed payments, compounding interest, and accrued late penalties. It invoked the acceleration clause, transforming the monthly obligation into an immediate demand for the entire principal balance. The directive was clear and unforgiving. The document demanded the entire past due balance be cleared via certified funds within exactly 10 business days. If the certified wire transfer failed to clear the holding company's escrow account by the strict deadline, the property would be seized without further judicial intervention and auctioned to the highest bidder. My role as the senior portfolio manager required a final audit of the liquidation ledger before the legal department dispatched the physical mandate. I opened the itemized penalty sheet on my secondary monitor. I reviewed the columns detailing the default interest rates and the standard corporate late fees. The mathematics were flawless, representing the cold, unyielding reality of commercial consequence. Yet a singular personal detail remained unresolved. The ledger reflected the mechanical failure of his contracting business, but it lacked the specific signature of the 8-year timeline. I moved my cursor to the bottom of the penalty column. I clicked the function key to insert a manual line item. The system generated a blank row. I typed the description into the designated cell. I labeled it as an administrative processing fee. I moved to the monetary value column. A typical corporate processing fee hovers around $200. I did not enter a standard corporate rate. I typed the numbers 5 and 0, $50. It was the exact monetary value of the crisp green bill Richard pulled from his worn leather wallet while leaning against the doorway of the farmhouse. It was the precise amount he wagered with my mother, betting I would return in 6 months, stripped of my dignity. He used that specific sum to quantify my failure. I integrated that exact sum into the legal document that would initiate his eviction. The $50 surcharge did not materially impact the massive 6-figure deficit he owed. Its value was entirely psychological. It was a digital receipt, a silent, undeniable echo of the freezing November afternoon when he turned his daughter into a sporting wager. It was the final stitch required to complete the ledger. I reviewed the updated column. The $50 charge sat quietly at the bottom of the list of staggering penalties. I clicked the authorization icon. The system locked the ledger and appended it to the notice of intent to foreclose. I signaled the legal department to proceed. The corporate machinery finalized the output. The physical documents were printed, collated, and sealed within a thick, rigid cardboard envelope. The firm did not utilize standard postal delivery for foreclosure mandates. The element of surprise is a liability in legal proceedings. The mandate required documented proof of receipt. The legal department dispatched the envelope via a specialized certified commercial courier service. The tracking number populated on my screen. I watched the digital status update as the package left the Bozeman facility, initiating its transit across state lines. The physical manifestation of his ruin was currently loaded onto a freight truck, hurtling down the interstate toward rural Oregon. The 10-day countdown would officially commence the moment Richard signed the electronic delivery tablet. He had spent the last 4 months bragging about floating loans and outsmarting bureaucrats. He believed his silence was a shield. He was entirely unaware that his silence merely provided the necessary legal runway for the holding company to finalize the acquisition of his land. The certified package navigated the logistics networks, passing through sorting hubs and distribution centers. The tracking software indicated an estimated delivery for the following Tuesday morning. The timing aligned with precision. The following Tuesday also marked the 8th anniversary of my departure from the farmhouse. For 7 consecutive years, I utilized that specific date to mail a visual receipt of my survival. I sent photographs of cheap apartment doors, college diplomas, and the brass keys to my century-old duplex. I used the vintage postage stamps to mark the distance I traveled away from their toxicity. The 8th anniversary required a different caliber of correspondence. The era of proving my survival was over. The era of executing the liquidation had arrived. The certified courier would deliver the sterile legal mandate, but I needed to deliver the personal context. I opened the top drawer of my mahogany desk and retrieved a heavy piece of ivory corporate cardstock. I prepared to draft the final installment of the postcard ritual, unaware that the ink I was about to apply would trigger a physical breach of my Bozeman sanctuary. The 8th anniversary of my departure arrived on a crisp, cloudless Tuesday morning. The Montana frost clung to the edges of the floor-to-ceiling windows in my 14th floor office. For 7 years, this specific date triggered a ritual rooted in self-preservation. I spent those previous anniversaries proving my existence, mailing photographs of my modest milestones back to the people who bet on my starvation. Those earlier postcards were defensive maneuvers. They were small, defiant flares sent up from a distance to signal that the hostile environment had not consumed me. Year 8 required a fundamental shift in strategy. The era of proving my capability was obsolete. I was no longer a target evading capture. I was the architect of the impending liquidation. The documentation required to finalize his ruin was already loaded onto a commercial freight truck hurtling toward his zip code. The 8th postcard would serve not as a receipt of my survival, but as the formal introduction of his landlord. I logged into the proprietary mapping software utilized by the Distressed Asset Division. The program aggregates high-resolution satellite imagery, municipal zoning overlays, and topological data to evaluate the physical condition of commercial collateral. I typed the geographical coordinates of the Oregon family farm into the search parameters. The system rendered a pristine aerial photograph of the 70-acre property. The image displayed the undeniable decay of Richard's legacy. The satellite lens captured the sagging roofline of the main barn. It highlighted the rusted, empty equipment lot where the heavy machinery used to sit before the shadow lender repossessed his fleet. The sprawling fields, once a source of deep patriarchal pride, appeared unkempt and fallow. The visual evidence perfectly mirrored the financial insolvency documented in his commercial ledger. I routed the high-definition file to the premium laser printer positioned in the corner of my office. The machine produced a vibrant, glossy print of the ruined structure. I retrieved a blank piece of heavy ivory corporate cardstock from my desk drawer. The paper possessed a substantial, expensive weight, a distinct contrast to the cheap pharmacy postcards I utilized in my early 20s. I secured the aerial photograph to the front of the ivory card, smoothing the edges until the visual presentation was immaculate. I flipped the card over. I retrieved my silver fountain pen from its leather case. I uncapped the instrument and rested the nib against the textured paper. A lesser person might have utilized the moment to unleash a decade of suppressed rage. A bitter child might have drafted a lengthy, vindictive paragraph detailing every stolen dollar, every mocked ambition, and every forged signature. Emotion implies a lingering vulnerability, and I refused to grant him the satisfaction of my anger. I wrote a single, devastatingly concise paragraph. The sentences were factual and devoid of sentiment. Day 2, 920. I am the Senior Portfolio Manager of Keystone Heritage Holdings. The arrears are due on the 1st. See you soon, Mabel. I did not add an exclamation point. The legal reality required no embellishment. I addressed the right side of the card to Richard Wood. I extracted a vintage postage stamp from a small brass container on my desk and pressed the adhesive into the upper right corner. I walked out of my glass office, navigated the quiet trading floor, and dropped the heavy ivory cardstock into the polished brass mail chute near the elevator bank. The faint sound of the paper sliding down 14 floors signaled the end of the defensive ritual. The transaction was finalized. 400 miles away, the logistics networks converged with surgical precision. The rural Oregon postal carrier navigated the familiar gravel driveway of the Wood family farm. He deposited the daily stack of past-due utility bills and local advertisements into the rusted metal receptacle mounted near the road. The glossy ivory cardstock slipped into the center of the bundle. Simultaneously, a commercial courier van pulled up to the front porch. The driver stepped out holding an electronic delivery tablet and the thick, rigid cardboard envelope containing the notice of intent to foreclose. Richard stepped out onto the porch. He wore a stained canvas jacket, his posture defensive and exhausted. He signed the electronic tablet, assuming the package contained another routine legal document regarding Harrison's civil lawsuit. The courier handed him the envelope and returned to the van. Richard walked to the mailbox, retrieved the daily postal delivery, and returned to the shelter of his front porch. He tore open the rigid cardboard envelope first. He extracted the sterile corporate letterhead. His eyes scanned the unyielding legal verbiage. The document outlined the 4 missed payments, the compounding interest, and the strict 10-day deadline to clear the entire principal balance via certified funds. He saw the invocation of the acceleration clause. He saw the threat of immediate property seizure and public auction. He looked at the itemized penalty sheet, his eyes passing over standard late fees until they hit the manual entry at the bottom of the column. Administrative processing fee, $50. The specificity of the amount likely caused a brief, confusing dissonance in his mind. He set the legal mandate down on a small wooden table. He picked up the stack of standard mail. He flipped through the windowed envelopes. The heavy ivory cardstock fluttered and landed face up on the wooden planks. He looked down. He saw the high-resolution aerial photograph of his own crumbling farm. He picked up the heavy paper, turning the card around to read the solicitation. His eyes scanned the blue ink. He recognized the sharp loops of the handwriting. He read the brief factual sentences. The facade of his untouchable superiority dissolved instantly. The faceless corporate entity that had just purchased the deed to his land, the ruthless holding company demanding immediate payment of a 6-figure deficit, was not a syndicate of anonymous bankers. It was the 18-year-old girl he mocked in that exact doorway 8 years ago. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The sudden lack of oxygen made him dizzy. His empire was a corpse. His bank accounts were empty. He had mortgaged his history to save a golden child who bankrupted him, and the entity holding the final bill was the daughter he bet against. Panic is a potent catalyst for a man accustomed to controlling the narrative through intimidation. Cornered desperation quickly morphed into blistering rage. He refused to accept defeat at the hands of someone he deemed inferior. He convinced himself the legal document was a temporary technicality. He believed if he could just bypass the corporate bureaucracy and exert his patriarchal authority, he could bully the holding company into tearing up the eviction notice. He grabbed the notice of intent to foreclose. He located the bold, toll-free customer service number printed at the top of the Keystone Heritage Holdings letterhead. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed the digits. He prepared to scream at a low-level call center representative. He intended to demand a manager escalate his grievances and threaten frivolous litigation to stall the foreclosure timeline. He did not understand the structural architecture of a blind LLC operating under a distressed asset division. Keystone Heritage Holdings did not employ a customer service department. The LLC existed solely on paper to shield my identity during the acquisition phase. The toll-free number listed on the legal mandate did not route to a crowded call center in another state. It routed directly through the firm's private branch exchange system. Sitting at my mahogany desk in Bozeman, my secondary corporate line illuminated. The digital display indicated an incoming call routed from the Keystone Heritage Public Directory. I picked up the receiver. I did not utilize my standard corporate greeting. I pressed the phone to my ear and remained entirely silent. Richard did not wait for a representative to speak. He launched into a booming, aggressive tirade. He shouted his full legal name. He cited the account number listed on the foreclosure notice. He screamed that the 10-day deadline was illegal, demanding to speak to the senior manager in charge of the Oregon agricultural portfolio. He threatened to sue the holding company for predatory lending practices, his voice vibrating with frantic desperation. I let him scream into the receiver for exactly 15 seconds. I listened to the patriarch, who bet on my starvation, beg a phantom corporation for leniency. When he paused to draw a ragged breath, I leaned closer to the microphone. "The deadline is not negotiable, Richard," I stated softly. "The funds are due on the 1st. The silence that followed was profound. The sound of his own daughter's voice, speaking with the cold authority of the holding company, traveled across the cellular network. The psychological snap was audible over the line. He dropped the phone. I heard the device clatter against the wooden planks of his porch, followed by the heavy, frantic sound of his boots running toward the gravel driveway. The intimidation tactics failed locally, and the realization drove him to execute a desperate physical escalation that would bridge the 800 miles between us. The dropped cell phone resting on the wooden planks of the Oregon porch broadcasted the sound of a heavy diesel engine roaring to life. I severed the connection from my Bozeman office and placed the receiver back onto its cradle. The reaction was predictable. A man who constructs his entire identity around intimidation cannot process a defeat delivered through certified mail and a toll-free number. The digital boundary I erected neutralized his authority, leaving physical confrontation as his only remaining recourse. Richard did not pause to lock the front door of the farmhouse. He did not leave instructions for Susan or Harrison regarding the impending foreclosure. He operated purely on volatile, unadulterated adrenaline. He threw his truck into gear, the tires spinning against the gravel driveway, and merged onto the eastbound interstate. He faced an 800-mile journey across state lines. The drive spanned the treacherous mountain passes of the Pacific Northwest, a geographical barrier that demands focus and caution. He likely drove with white-knuckled tension, rehearsing the booming demands he intended to hurl across my desk. He convinced himself the sheer force of his physical presence would shatter my corporate facade, forcing me to rip up the promissory note and restore his empire. While Richard navigated the treacherous highway attempting to outrun the mathematics of his ruin, I remained at my secure terminal. I utilized the transit time to finalize the liquidation protocols. I authorized the secondary legal counsel to prepare the public auction notices for the Oregon County Registry. I ensured every signature, every date, and every penalty clause adhered strictly to the parameters of the shadow loan contract. I locked the digital ledger, rendering the foreclosure process irreversible, barring a full, certified payment of the principal balance. The timeline seamlessly converged with the opening moment of this narrative. It was Tuesday afternoon, 2:14 p.m. The security strobe lights in the atrium of the Bozeman commercial high-rise cast a rhythmic pale blue glow across the imported Italian marble. Down in the lobby, the quiet, regulated efficiency of the underwriting firm fractured. Richard breached the perimeter. He tailgated an employee through the electronic security turnstiles, bypassing the exterior guard station. He wore the same salt-stained canvas work jacket he likely threw on before leaving the farm. His heavy boots left streaks of gray slush near the polished granite reception desk. The visual dissonance between his rough, unkempt exterior and the hyper-polished financial environment was stark. He did not care about the aesthetic mismatch. He operated on a singular, desperate delusion. He slammed his fist against the granite counter. He shouted my name, his voice echoing off the frosted glass panels, drawing startled glances from passing executives. He waved the crumpled Year 8 postcard in his right hand, demanding the receptionist summon me immediately. The young woman behind the desk did not flinch. She maintained a neutral facial expression and discreetly pressed the silent tactical button wired directly to the central dispatch center. 14 stories above the brewing chaos, the red light blinked on my multi-line office telephone. The director of building operations informed me an unauthorized male subject had breached the lobby and was creating a severe disturbance. I recognized the physical description instantly. I thanked the operations director, ended the call, and stood up from my mahogany desk. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal blazer. I picked up a single manila folder containing the finalized Notice of Intent to Foreclose. I exited my glass-enclosed office and swiped my encrypted identification badge against the private executive terminal. The brushed metal doors parted silently. I stepped inside the mahogany-paneled cab. From the vantage point of the descending executive glass elevator, I watched the scene unfold with the detached interest of an auditor reviewing a ledger. My pulse rested at a steady 60 beats per minute. The heavy doors slid apart, revealing the escalating tension. 3 tactical security guards dressed in dark suits had formed a loose perimeter around Richard. They kept their hands resting near their utility belts, speaking in low, de-escalation tones. Richard ignored their warnings. He paced back and forth like a cornered animal, clutching the glossy ivory cardstock. I stepped out of the elevator bay. The sharp click of my heels against the marble floor echoed through the vast space. Richard stopped pacing. He turned his head and locked eyes with me. He expected to find the timid, shrinking 18-year-old girl he mocked in the doorway. Instead, he faced a senior portfolio manager radiating cold, unyielding authority. The visual shock registered on his face, but desperation quickly overrode his capacity for logic. He saw the person holding the eviction notice to his failing legacy, and his instinct to dominate surged forward. He lunged past the nearest security guard. He charged in my direction, thrusting the crumpled postcard toward my face. He ordered me to cancel the foreclosure. His voice boomed, demanding I contact my legal team right this second and reverse the property acquisition. He invoked the concept of respect, screaming that a child must honor her father regardless of business technicalities. The 3 security guards recovered from his sudden movement. They rushed forward in a coordinated formation, extending their arms to physically subdue the intruder. They anticipated a volatile, physical escalation. They expected me to shrink back in terror. I did not take a single step backward. My posture remained rigid and flawless. I shifted my gaze from my father to the approaching guards. I raised one hand, extending my fingers in a calm, universally understood gesture to halt. The guards froze instantly, respecting the silent command of a senior executive. They stepped back, leaving a perimeter of open space, but remained highly alert. I slowly lowered my hand and returned my focus to the panting, furious man standing before me. I looked at the patriarch who confidently bet on my failure. I did not glare with hatred. I did not project fear or resentment. I studied his stained jacket, his trembling hands, and his desperate, wide eyes. I looked at him with an expression of freezing, clinical pity. I maintained absolute stillness. The ambient noise of the atrium faded into a dull thrum. I did not address him as a father. I addressed him exclusively as a delinquent commercial tenant. I informed Richard that he profoundly miscalculated the nature of our interaction. I stated clearly that this confrontation was not a familial dispute requiring mediation. It was a strict, unyielding business transaction. I outlined his exact financial position using the data points I memorized from his commercial ledger. I reminded him that his contracting business was severely past due regarding the mezzanine loan agreement on the agricultural parcel. I articulated the precise dollar amount he owed to Keystone Heritage Holdings, including the maximum allowable late penalties and the compounded interest charges. Richard attempted to interrupt my breakdown. He opened his mouth to launch another booming tirade, but the clinical delivery of his own financial ruin halted the words in his throat. I explained the fatal strategic error he committed. I laid out the timeline of his delinquency, noting he deliberately drained his operational reserves to fund the criminal defense attorney for a son who refused to work. I stripped away the protective euphemisms he utilized back in Oregon. I called Harrison exactly what he was in the eyes of the law, a liability that bankrupted his enterprise. I delivered the ultimate ultimatum. I stated the consequences of failure with zero ambiguity. The 10-day deadline outlined in the certified mandate was absolute. If the arrears were not satisfied by the close of business on the final day, my property management team would initiate immediate eviction proceedings. The locks on the farmhouse would be changed. The remaining acreage would be seized to satisfy the outstanding debt. The family farm would cease to exist. The realization of his utter lack of leverage finally pierced his stubborn ego. The anger evaporated from his face, replaced by a sudden, sickening terror. The booming patriarch vanished. In his place stood an aging, insolvent man, terrified of losing the only metric of success he understood. Recognizing that intimidation had failed spectacularly, Richard pivoted to his final, most insidious tactic. He deployed emotional manipulation. His rigid posture crumbled. He slumped his shoulders and let out a ragged, theatrical sob. He dropped to his knees on the polished Italian marble right in front of the security personnel and the lingering corporate executives. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing tears to leak down his weathered cheeks. He pleaded with me to reconsider the eviction notice. He claimed losing the commercial property would destroy my mother. He adopted a trembling pitch, weaving a tragic narrative about Susan, suffering from a severe, undiagnosed heart condition. He insisted the stress of a public bankruptcy would trigger a fatal cardiac event. He begged me to show mercy, attempting to anchor my professional decisions to the guilt of a hypothetical medical tragedy. I did not offer a comforting gesture. I did not waver in my resolve. I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. I thought about the drafty doorway. I thought about the $50 bill. I kept my voice perfectly even. The delivery was flat and devoid of sentiment. It took 8 years, Richard, I stated the words, carrying clearly across the quiet lobby. But you were right. Someone is begging. Richard stopped weeping instantly. The tears dried up as the realization set in that his final avenue of control was permanently closed. He was completely out of ammunition. He remained kneeling on the floor, exposed and utterly powerless. The silence stretching between us was profound. It was the sound of a long-standing wager being definitively settled. I stepped back, reestablishing the professional boundary. I turned my head and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the lead security guard. The tactical team mobilized immediately. 2 guards stepped forward and firmly grasped Richard by the upper arms. Their grip was unbreakable. They pivoted his body toward the revolving glass doors leading to the downtown streets. Richard did not struggle. The fight was completely drained from his system. The guards escorted him across the vast atrium. His heavy work boots dragged against the marble, leaving a faint trail of slush behind him. Just before he reached the exit threshold, he twisted his torso against the grip of the security personnel. He looked back over his shoulder, his eyes locked onto mine one last time. He raised his right hand, the knuckles white from the strain. Clutched tightly in his fist was the crushed Year 8 postcard. The glossy photograph of his ruined legacy served as the final, enduring image of his absolute defeat. The guards pushed him through the revolving doors, depositing him onto the curb in the freezing Montana air, leaving me to return to the 14th floor and finalize the liquidation of his life. 30 days after the security personnel escorted my father out of the Bozeman high-rise, the legal parameters of his eviction finalized. The 10-day grace period outlined in the certified mandate expired without a single certified wire transfer hitting the escrow account of Keystone Heritage Holdings. Richard possessed 0 remaining avenues for stalling the inevitable. The machinery of commercial foreclosure operates with cold, unyielding finality. There were no dramatic standoffs at the edge of the property line. There were no emotional pleas negotiated on the front porch. A local county sheriff arrived at the agricultural parcel, accompanied by a contracted locksmith. They severed the rusted padlocks on the barn doors and installed commercial-grade deadbolts across every entrance. Orange legal notices were taped to the glass panes, warning against unauthorized trespassing. The ground Richard used to anchor his patriarchal identity officially transferred to my corporate portfolio. I did not retain the acreage. Holding physical property out of state creates unnecessary logistical liabilities. The Distressed Asset Division facilitated a swift public auction. A neighboring commercial agricultural conglomerate purchased the 70 acres for a premium cash offer, eager to absorb the fertile soil into their own yield projections. The transaction cleared the Federal Reserve. The profit margin realized from the sale covered the principal balance of the mezzanine loan, satisfied the accrued default penalties, and delivered a highly lucrative return on investment for the underwriting firm. The digital ledger associated with the Wood family farm zeroed out. I archived the file on my secure terminal, closing the chapter with a single keystroke. The numbers balanced perfectly. The financial collapse stripped away the protective insulation surrounding my parents. The illusion of their local supremacy evaporated the moment the sheriff cruiser idled in their driveway. Richard and Susan were forced to vacate the premises, packing their remaining personal effects into rented moving vans. Stripped of their commercial acreage and credit lines, they relocated to a cramped, drafty rental unit on the industrial outskirts of a neighboring town. The social fallout was swift and unforgiving. Susan could no longer curate a pristine digital narrative. The community forums where she once received praise for her family unity grew silent. The acquaintances who previously attended her catered events now averted their eyes in the grocery aisles. The humiliation was relentless and public. Richard, a man who once boomed orders across active construction sites, found himself sitting in a small living room with no equipment, no crew, and zero authority. His empire was reduced to a few cardboard boxes. The most profound descent belonged to the golden child. Harrison no longer possessed a financial safety net to catch him when he stumbled. The civil lawsuit resulting from his uninsured construction collapse required strict, court-mandated restitution installments. Failing to pay the injured parties meant an immediate transfer to a state penitentiary for criminal negligence. Without Richard to subsidize his existence, Harrison faced the stark, unforgiving reality of the labor market. The brother who previously demanded luxury rentals and premium ski passes was forced to secure a minimum wage position at a local fast food franchise. His daily routine shifted from phantom executive meetings to standing over an industrial deep fryer. He learned the exact value of a dollar the hard way. His uniform smelled perpetually of burnt oil and chemical sanitizers. The grease stained his fingernails, and his arches ached from standing on slippery linoleum floors for 10-hour shifts. Every Friday, he cashed his meager paycheck and walked directly to the county courthouse. He stood in line, handing the vast majority of his physical labor over to a municipal clerk just to avoid wearing a prison uniform. He was learning the mechanics of survival through sheer attrition. He discovered that luxury is a privilege earned through calculated effort, not an inherent birthright granted by a shared last name. I observed the fallout from a safe, elevated distance. The winter snows melted across the Gallatin Valley, giving way to a crisp Montana spring. I sat at the quartz island in my renovated century-old duplex. The morning sun streamed through the custom wooden blinds, casting warm, geometric patterns across the reclaimed oak floorboards. I brewed a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, enjoying the aromatic scent of roasted beans mingling with the faint smell of cedarwood. The environment thrived on mutual respect and peaceful ambition. I sorted through the daily postal delivery, expecting the usual assortment of utility invoices and corporate correspondence. My fingers brushed against a small rectangular envelope hidden near the bottom of the stack. The paper was plain white and thin, lacking the heavy weight of professional cardstock. The sender did not include a return address in the upper left corner. My name and Bozeman address were handwritten in blue ink. I recognized the penmanship, but it looked shaky and uncertain, lacking the sprawling, arrogant loops I remembered from our youth. I flipped the envelope over and examined the postage mark stamped across the right corner. The black ink indicated the letter originated from a rural Oregon sorting facility. It traveled 800 miles to reach my door. The sudden arrival of correspondence from my hometown sent a brief analytical ripple through my calculated calm. I picked up a silver letter opener from the counter. I slid the cold metal blade under the paper flap, breaking the seal with a crisp, tearing sound. I tilted the envelope downward. A small stack of currency slipped out and landed on the smooth quartz surface. There were 10 $20 bills. The paper money looked worn and heavily circulated. The edges were frayed, and the faces of the presidents were faded from passing through countless hands. I stared at the specific numerical value, $200. It was the exact sum stolen from my canvas duffel bag a decade ago in the freezing bus terminal. The sight of the cash triggered a visceral memory of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead while I gripped my empty leather wallet. A small square of yellow adhesive paper clung to the back of the currency. I peeled the sticky note off the bills. The handwriting belonged to Harrison. The letters were cramped, written by a hand accustomed to scrubbing fryers rather than holding designer ski poles. He wrote 2 brief sentences. "I am sorry for the theft. How did you start over?" I read the words multiple times. The ink carried the weight of profound devastation. I looked at the wrinkled bills. The money represented hours of grueling manual labor over boiling oil. Harrison bypassed paying his own heating bill or purchasing groceries to return the stolen funds. It was his first genuine act of accountability. He acknowledged the original sin that launched my journey. I evaluated the narrative I held for 8 years. I always viewed my older brother as the fortunate sibling, the one who occupied a position of supreme privilege while I fought for scraps. Standing in my quiet kitchen, I recognized the tragic flaw in my logic. Harrison was never the fortunate child. He was the ultimate victim of the Wood family dynamic. Richard and Susan did not nurture him. They cultivated a captive audience. They built a golden cage around him, decorating the bars with unearned capital and shielding him from every hardship. By protecting him from failure, they effectively amputated his ability to survive. When the financial walls collapsed, he lacked the muscle memory to rebuild. He possessed no calluses. He possessed no grit. I survived because the cold reality of the world forced me to adapt. I learned to negotiate commercial leases and analyze distressed assets because hunger is a ruthless teacher. I gained resilience. Harrison received a crippling dependency. His inheritance was an illusion of superiority that shattered the moment he faced the real world. The yellow sticky note posed a desperate question. A lingering societal expectation whispered that I should pick up my smartphone. The old rules of family obligation suggested I should dial his number. I could offer words of comfort. I could wire him $1,000 to ease his current struggle. I could invite him to Montana, offer him the spare bedroom in my duplex, and utilize my corporate connections to secure him a decent entry-level job. I could become his savior and finally prove my moral superiority over my parents. I rejected the impulse instantly. Rescuing Harrison would simply replace the toxic enablement of my parents with my own version of charity. True independence is not a commodity you can transfer through a digital bank transaction. It is a structure you must build brick by brick with your own bruised hands. Bringing him into my sanctuary would only restart the cycle of dependency. He needed to learn how to navigate the cold. He needed to figure out how to stretch $20 to cover a week of groceries. He needed to discover his own internal fortitude. The boundary I established remained impenetrable. There would be no tearful reunion. There would be no rescue mission. I left the currency on the kitchen island. I walked down the hallway and entered my home office. The room felt serene and grounded. I sat behind my mahogany desk and opened the top right drawer. I reached into the back corner and retrieved a single piece of heavy, ivory corporate cardstock. It was the final blank postcard in my possession. For the past 8 years, I utilized these cards to document my ascent. I wrote factual updates and printed photographs of my milestones. I used the ink to declare my survival against their sabotage. I placed the blank rectangle on the smooth wood grain of my desk. I picked up my silver fountain pen. I did not write a list of instructions on the back. I did not offer a motivational quote or a numbered plan for financial recovery. I left the message space entirely empty. I turned the card over. I addressed it to the rundown apartment complex near the Oregon Industrial Zone where Harrison now resided. I opened my brass container and extracted the last vintage postage stamp. I pressed the adhesive backing into the upper right corner. The pristine blank card represented the exact answer he required. It was the only tool I could ethically provide. A blank slate. The profound realization that his story was no longer written by Richard or Susan. The ink belonged to him. Now he held the power to write his own future without their interference. I carried the addressed postcard out the front door of my duplex. The morning air felt crisp and clean. I walked to the corner and pulled open the iron handle of the blue postal box. I dropped the heavy ivory cardstock into the chute. The paper slipped away into the darkness. The transaction finalized nearly a decade of quiet warfare. I turned around and walked back to my property. I stepped inside and locked the deadbolt. The brass mechanism clicked with a solid, reassuring weight, securing my fortress. I sat down at my kitchen island and took a slow sip of the dark roast coffee. The ledger was balanced. The bet was settled. I closed my eyes and surrounded myself with the quiet, expensive silence of total self-reliance.